Welcome to the Interview Prep Guru, where I help you get prepared, get confident, and get the job. I'm a real Google hiring manager and a professional interview coach. I've spent hundreds of hours on the other side of the table. I've truly seen and heard it all. And this channel is all about sharing the best interview tips with you so that you can ace that job interview and land a job that you never thought you could get. My interview coaching clients pay $200 an hour to learn these exact same proven interview tips. Thanks to my coaching and their hard work, many of them have landed their dream jobs, including jobs they never dreamed they could get at big tech companies like Facebook, Google, and Amazon. Today I'll be sharing my top 3 proven interview tips learned from hundreds of hours of interviewing and one-on-one coaching so that you can follow a proven success formula as you prepare for your interview. You simply cannot get tips like this from anywhere else. I'm detailed and specific because I'm an actual, real Google hiring manager. I've learned all of these tips from conducting hundreds of interviews and spending hundreds of hours in one-on-one interview coaching to help people like you land their dream jobs. So stop scrolling through dozens of generic top 10 lists that all say the same basic things and start doing these 3 proven interview tips. If you take my advice and follow these 3 interview tips as you prepare for your interview, I guarantee you will be prepared and confident in your interviews. I will be sharing some interview tips that took me an entire career to learn. There's one tip in particular that no one else will tell you. It took me almost 15 years to figure these out, and they're all here for you. Here are my top 3 proven interview tips at a high level. We'll dive into each one in detail so that you know exactly how to use these interview tips to ace your interview. First, you need to know your story. Next, you need to do your research. And last, you need to bring it on your interview day. Let's dive into the first interview tip. Know your story. Your story is the body of work and life experience that you have gained over the course of your life and professional career. And like any story, there are many chapters, plot twists, and a lot of rich, detailed content. As you prepare for your interview, you need to make sure that you know your story well, including all of the key chapters, plot twists, and characters. Most interviews today focus on behavioral or situational interviewing, which aims to learn about how you've handled certain types of situations in the past as a way to understand how you might approach them in the future. In order to understand and answer a behavioral question effectively, you need to be able to quickly index through your entire story in your mind. You need to pick the right chapter to recount to the interviewer, and you need to recall many details. I have a couple of actionable tips that will help you recall the parts of your story that will be most useful in your interviews. First, you need to take a detailed walk down memory lane. Think about your last 3 years of life or work experience. Consider the top 3 major projects, initiatives, or efforts that you've worked on. If you're in high school or college, these may be school projects or side projects that you've worked on. They don't all have to be work-related. Maybe you tutored someone and they aced their test. This can be an excellent chapter to revisit and bring into your story. If you're interviewing later in your career, I generally expect candidates to be able to describe in great detail any projects that they have worked on in the last 3 years. And as a general interview tip, I do not expect for people to remember or bring up projects from longer than 5 years back. Remember, you're interviewing for a job that should be moving your career forward. So the scope and responsibilities that you had 5 years ago, or even 3 years ago, are likely not representative of the level of work that you can achieve today. So strive to remember 3 projects that are more recent and that highlight the level of responsibility, complexity, and impact that you want this interviewer to know you can achieve. After you identify those 3 major recent projects, write down the following information about each of them. First, the context. Describe the goals and the driving need for this project. This can be from a business perspective, from a strategic perspective, and tactically, what were the outcomes that were desired from this project? Secondly, what was your role in the project? Be specific about what you were responsible for. Next, recall what happened on the project. How did the project get planned? How did you execute your piece of the project? What went well? What went wrong? And ultimately, what was the outcome of the project? Next, recall what you learned from working on this project. Every manager and every company wants to hire people who demonstrate bravery in the face of challenge and who can learn from their past experiences and get better over time. Make sure that you can articulate what you learned on this project. Next, write down what you would do differently if you were faced with the same project today. Even when projects go well, there's probably some aspect that you would do differently to make the project better in some way. Maybe you would have spent more time planning the project to avoid issues during the execution phase. Maybe you would have liked to spend more time learning about what the end user needed so that you could design a better solution. Maybe you would have managed team morale better. Either way, you should be prepared to talk about how you would approach this project more optimally if given the same project today. Once again, this demonstrates that you have a growth mindset and you strive to be better every day. Okay, wonderful. You now know the walking down memory lane framework. You've walked down memory lane for one major project or chapter in your story. Do this again for all 3 of your recent major projects. Now it's time to get comfortable with what makes you uncomfortable. Take a look at your resume and your LinkedIn profile. What do you see there that you're most nervous about being asked about in your interview? Maybe it's been a while since you coded in that one language, or a real long time since you wrote a SQL script, or maybe you just aren't quite an expert in that one tool. Or maybe one of your experiences listed is a little, let's say, overstated. Anything on your resume that makes you squeamish when you imagine being asked questions about it. That's what we're talking about in this next interview tip. You need to get comfortable with what makes you uncomfortable, because if you happen to get asked about that experience or skill or tool, you need to be able to address the question with calm and confidence. For many people, this means you just need to refresh some of your skills or refamiliarize yourself with that tool. But either way, you need to be able to speak with comfort about anything on your resume or LinkedIn. All right, that brings us to my final interview tip when it comes to knowing your story. Dial in your communication. Time and time again, I coach people who have great skills and fantastic experience, but who struggle to convey their skills and experience effectively in their interview. For some people, it's an issue of speaking too quickly or too slowly, so I coach them on pace. For others, it's an issue of packaging. The content of their story is good, but the structure is all over the place. Imagine reading a book where the chapters are randomly ordered, or even a chapter where the phrases and paragraphs are randomly ordered. That sounds really hard, right? I can tell you that as an interviewer, it's really hard for me to assess your capabilities for a role if I can't understand or make sense of what you're telling me. When it comes to interviews, good communication breaks down into 2 major components: structure and pace. I've designed an exercise that you can do to check your communication structure and pace, and to diagnose if you need to work on either structure or pace. For this communication effectiveness exercise, find a friend who is the least like you in the way that they communicate, and ideally, not a family member. The reason you should pick someone unlike you is that they will be better able to identify any structure or pace issues, since they naturally communicate differently than you. Have them ask you to tell them about the most complex project you've ever worked on. In case you didn't notice, this exercise is a bit of a double dip, and you're welcome. It's not only a communication effectiveness diagnostic tool, it's also a great way to practice talking through your story using the walking down memory lane framework that I just taught you. After you tell this friend about this complex project, ask them how well they understood your story. Ask them about the pace of your speaking. Did you speak too quickly, too slowly, or at just the right pace? Ask about the structure of the story. Was it hard to follow, easy to follow, or somewhere in between? Were there areas where you gave too few or too many details? This feedback is gold. It will help you diagnose if you have a communication issue to work on. If that friend says there's no problem with your pace or structure, find 2 more friends and practice with them. If all three say they completely understood your story, you're good to go. Move on to the next tip. If you uncover from the communication effectiveness exercises that there are pace challenges with your interview communication, here's how you resolve it. If you've ever listened to an audiobook, you know that you can increase or decrease playback speed. In fact, you may have me on 1.25x on YouTube right now, which is great. Now, for most people with pacing problems, it's likely that you're talking too fast. To resolve this, imagine that you have internal settings for your own playback speed. Now imagine setting your speaking pace settings to 0.75x for the entirety of your interview prep and on interview day. I even suggest placing a sticky note on your monitor if you're doing a virtual interview. On that sticky note, you can write 0.75x or speak slowly to remind you to speak slowly during game time. If you're a fast talker, trust me, this will be a mighty challenge on interview day when you get nervous, so you need the reminder right in front of your face. For what it's worth, I have a speak slowly sticker on my monitor right now to remind me to do exactly the same. If you realize from the communication effectiveness exercise that you have structural challenges with your storytelling, go back to the walking down memory lane framework I taught you earlier. This is the structure you should use not just to plan your stories and to remember them, but to tell them as well. Always start by setting the context. Then tell them what happened. Then explain what you learned and round it off with what you do differently if you were given the same situation today. Practice is the best solution when you are struggling to dial in your communication structure. And getting your storytelling structure dialed in is the most important interview tip in this entire video. It truly breaks my heart every time I have to pass on a candidate because they don't know how to package their story, even if they have great experience and skills that I need on the team. But it's also a huge risk to me as a manager and to the company to bring on someone who struggles to communicate effectively. Even if you have all the skills needed for the job, you must clearly communicate in your interview if you want to land the job. I'm going to say it one more time in case you're skipping around in the video to make sure I catch you, since this is one of the most important interview tips in this video. The pace and structure of your communication during an interview will determine how effectively you convey your experience and skills to the interviewers. If we don't understand your stories, we can't determine if you will be right for the team. So communication ends up having a disproportionate impact on the likelihood of you getting the job. Take the time to dial in your communication structure and pace. Moving on to our second interview tip, do your research. This interview tip breaks down into 3 actionable exercises. First, you need to know the role. Read the job description a few times before your interview. Map keywords or phrases that are in the job description to your own resume. You can use color coding, icons, circles, emojis, really whatever works that helps you map that job description to your own experience. For example, if the job description calls for driving process improvements, make sure to map that phrase on the job description to the past projects listed on your resume where you were in fact driving process improvements. In the interview, you can then weave those mapped words and phrases as you respond to interview questions. Doing this will subtly and subconsciously reinforce your fit for the role. When you use their language to describe your experience, you have mastered this interview tip. Until then, keep mapping. It always surprises me when candidates do not map their experience to the job description, since it's a tool that's available to them from the very start of their interview process. Using this mapping technique will not only give you subconscious fit points in the interviewer's mind, it will also actually help you prepare for the interview so that you will be more prepared for the role. So do it. Next, you need to know the company and about their business. We live in a world of infinite information access, so there's really no excuse for showing up without doing your research about the company. I'll break down exactly what you need to do and search for as you prepare with this interview tip. First, learn about the industry. I'm always surprised when people ask me questions about the industry during an interview. You want to come in with some thoughts on the direction of the industry. A great way to look into this is to look at some industry trend reports that major consulting firms and Wall Street analysts put together pretty regularly. Some of these reports can be behind paywalls, but you can always find some great free nuggets as well. Next, learn about some recent wins for the company. Read their recent press releases. As a hint, press releases are usually available on the company's website. If the company is public, you can search for recent news associated with their stock ticker as well. Lastly, take some time to learn about your interviewers. Remember that interviewers are people too, and it helps to have context around who they are, their backgrounds, and their role in the company. Some recruiters will directly give you the names of your interviewers, and then you can use LinkedIn to learn more about their role at the company, their background, and their prior experience. If the recruiter can't give you the interviewers' names, usually this is because there's a company policy in place. And instead, you can ask if the recruiter will share the interviewer's roles or titles so that you can prepare appropriate questions given their place in the company. This ask usually works. One thing to note here is that interviewers appreciate a prepared candidate who has researched the industry, the company, and even their professional background. However, there is such a thing as doing too much research on your interviewers, and it can come across as creepy. Interviewers usually do not appreciate advanced research findings like commenting on their Instagram photos or Facebook posts. If you discuss the background of the candidate at any point in the interview, make sure you keep it professional and don't bring up personal information into the conversation. With all of this research in hand, now it's time to synthesize. You should formulate a sufficient number of questions about the role, the company, or about your interviewer's expectations of the role. For a phone screen, 3 prepared questions is sufficient, and you can always ask a question on the fly if something in the interview piques your curiosity and inspires a question. And just so you know, interviewers love that. For an on-site interview, prepare at least 2 questions per interview slot so that you don't run out of questions and potentially panic. As with phone screens, interviewers love when you ask them questions that refer to some of the questions or background context that they covered in the interview. You never have to work off of your prepared questions, but they are really nice to have as a backup. In the future, I'll release a video specifically about how you can formulate these questions for interviewers at the end of your interview. For now, I've populated a few questions that I enjoy being asked as an interviewer, in case you want to borrow them. This should be considered a starting point. Don't just grab them and use them as is. I can tell you that the questions that candidates ask at the end of the interview can really sway my thinking about that candidate. Take time to formulate some questions that are tailored to the company, the team, and the role that you're interviewing for. My last interview tip is the one that has taken me 15 years to really put my finger on. You need to bring it on your interview day. I've interviewed many people who were very qualified for the role they were interviewing for, but after the interview, I ultimately passed on them because they didn't follow this final interview tip. IT is an acronym that stands for inquisitive and thoughtful. You need to ask questions and be engaged throughout the entire interview. There is really nothing worse than a candidate who expresses little interest in the role or in the company, and candidates who are less expressive can find this challenging. You don't have to adopt a caricature of yourself and be over-the-top happy, wiggling your eyebrows and nodding your head the entire interview. But you do need to be thoughtful and appear engaged and focused. And you need to show your interest in the role by asking questions and treating the interview like a fact-finding mission on both sides. Remember, it's not just the company assessing you, you're assessing the company. The last 2 interview tips were all about getting your story together and being prepared. This 3rd interview tip is all about performance, and bringing it to the interview can make all the difference. These are my top 3 proven interview tips earned from 15 years being interviewed and conducting interviews with top-tier candidates as a hiring manager at Google, plus hundreds of hours in individualized coaching with job seekers. So know your story, do your research, and bring it on interview day. Subscribe to my channel and ring the bell to get my best interview tips faster. Please drop a comment in this video to give me ideas on other content or topics you'd like me to cover in future videos. And if you use these tips, drop a comment. Let me know how your interviews go. Best of luck and happy interview prep.